Cuba is slightly smaller than Pennsylvania and is 90 miles off the Floridian coast, and oh, what a critical role it plays in our history and our future. This presentation is about decisions being made today that will have an international impact on the US and Cuba. After Communist Fidel Castro overthrew the Cuban government in 1959, he nationalized more than $1 billion in American assets and signed a trade agreement with the Soviet Union. This caused diplomatic relations between the US and Cuba to break off and remain mostly frozen throughout the Cold War. Eisenhower sanctioned Cuba in 1960 and 61. Kennedy made the embargo official in 1962. The embargo is enforced mainly with six statutes, including the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. It keeps American companies from doing business in Cuba, and it prohibits Americans from traveling there or spending money as tourists. In December, President Obama declared, "Today, the United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba. In the most significant changes in our policy in more than 50 years, we will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests, and instead, we will begin to normalize relations between our two countries." This January 31st article inspired this presentation, and as I explored Cuba, I found that it is a good example of the four dimensions of distance mentioned in our textbook: culture, political, geographical, economical. So let's take a few minutes now to talk about what is changing between the US and Cuba. Tourism will definitely give a big boost to Cuba's economy. Remember in 2013 when Jay-Z went to Cuba, creating a political firestorm, and it prompted a strong response to his critics via a song entitled Open Letter? Well, what this means is that people like you and I, along with Jay-Z, can go there without creating political firestorms. Both countries will work towards its reestablishing embassies. The US will ease travel restrictions, making it easier for Americans to travel to Cuba and to do business there. Americans returning from a trip to Cuba can now return with up to $400 in Cuban goods, and a quarter of that amount can be spent on tobacco and alcohol. Lifting the embargo will make it easier for Americans to do business in Cuba. US and Cuban banks will be allowed to start building relationships, and that means American travelers will be able to use their credit and debit cards when visiting. Moving in the steps of rival MasterCard, American Express announced that they plan to launch services for their credit card users in Cuba. The international impact will continue as US business leaders are preparing to flood the island to explore new opportunities and learn about a market that has been closed for 50 years. The two sides agreed to open new trade channels for farming equipment, construction materials, and a wide variety of other resources for Cuba's emerging private entrepreneurs. U.S. telecommunication providers will have the opportunity to establish infrastructure and other necessary mechanisms to provide commercial telecommunications and internet services in Cuba. Business opportunities may seem modest for now, but some estimates show a $21 billion trade opportunity in the first 5 years if Congress lifts the embargo. Many vintage American cars survived as if in a time warp in Cuba. Easing relations could come as a boon to collectors looking to own or even drive pieces of Cuba's culture. Barred from importing newer models, Cubans have repaired the vehicles, which are now considered a national treasure. It's not just Americans who want to do business in Cuba. Canada's former ambassador, Mr. Entwistle, explained that FDI in Cuba is less than a tenth of 1% of GDP due to Cuba's reluctance to let anyone invest in its community. Now investors sense that Cuba will be offering opportunities for Canadians who already know Cuba so well to make some money. Business consulting also presents opportunities in Cuba. The travel expansion allows U.S. citizens to provide business training to private Cuban businesses and small farmers. According to a White House statement, Americans will also be able to provide other support for the growth of Cuba's nascent private sector. Some presidential candidates have emphatically defended the embargo. Jeb Bush, who is actively exploring a 2016 run, has said the ban should be strengthened, not lifted. Senator Rubio's parents fled Cuba after Castro's takeover, and he has called the embargo the last tool we have remaining to ensure that democracy returns to Cuba one day. So, classmates, stay tuned during the rest of 2015 because this is still a developing story. And despite President Obama's position on Cuba, Congress is the only entity that can lift the embargo. Only time will tell if we will once again see US and Cuba flags side by side in Cuba.